Hello, everyone. Hello, and welcome to the Secure Chain Con 2026 conference. My name is Vanessa Tovis, and by trade, I am a Microsoft 365 Solutions Architect. For Druva's, for those of you who aren't aware, Druva is a data protection first company and cyber resilience second, right? So for Druva, I'm a subject matter expert on all things Microsoft because I've been working with those technologies since the very first versions of SharePoint on-prem, Microsoft SQL Server, Microsoft's BI suite, and my career just paralleled that investment and that move into the cloud. And as a solutions architect and a subject matter expert for Druva, I get to represent how this platform is used and work with a lot of our customers in that manner. So today we're going to focus on strengthening your cyber resilience for your Microsoft ecosystem. And that ecosystem is very broad, right? So let's just kind of first talk and level set about the concept of what cyber resilience is versus like a backup, right? So early in my career, this concept of a rubber ball, glass ball was introduced, and it was simple. It was really aligned with task management. And that was within a given day or a given hour, you only had so much time and you had a certain amount of tasks that you had to complete. And you had to know and be able to juggle of all those tasks, which ones you could push off a little and they would still be okay. And which ones, if you did push them off, they would, as a glass ball concept, fall to the ground and shatter. And that really is a lot about what we're going to talk about, which is like cyber resilience. Knowing and understanding the data that we use and interact with on a daily basis in this ecosystem of Microsoft's, and how we are going to be responding to a lot of these threats that are occurring. Now, if we talk about the threats and the obstacles, by all means, the attackers, right? These are the criminal organizations that are there to take your data, take your money. And these organizations are very smart. They're very patient. They have skills. They have resources, and they work together. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But ultimately, they have monetized our misery, right? The misery of accessing and illegally accessing your information. Engineers are human, and we're talking about the Microsoft engineers, of course. Right. By no means do they intend to introduce vulnerabilities, but that is just by the nature of this platform and any platform what happens. The data loss gaps in the platform. I've been working with this from, since I started with Druva about 6 years ago, just socializing the message about this, that there are use cases in which certain things, certain features and functionalities were created, and cyber resilience was never included in that architecture. And even Microsoft alone is also telling their customers you can't rely on things like e-discovery or version history or the recycle bin, because that's not right. Those are collaborative type features. Users and admins, the last one in this, by all means, it never really matters where something is hosted or housed. With a user, right? They see a button and they will press it. And they're not familiar with the fact that the move function was never designed as a migration tool. And that folder they picked up had 27,000 files and 4,000 subfolders. And the support ticket that you get is something like this. It's like, oh, I moved that, but I think half of the data is here and the other half is over here, I think. Right. So they're just by the nature of what they do and what they have access to, users will always have that impact in terms of a data loss. Admins, being an admin myself, especially as the platform has just changed and grown over this last several years, there's a lot of, whether it's lack of knowledge or just lack of exposure and understanding that can be I don't want to say tapped into, that can be taken, that an admin can fall into a trap, right, of accidentally setting a policy and forgetting about it or never auditing, and you turn around and the data's gone. So across this world of from the criminal activity to accidental, right, you have a concept of being resilient. And we're going to really kind of we're going to continue to focus around, this platform and the vulnerabilities that you're going to face. And so the overall vulnerabilities from 2024 to 2025 regarding the Microsoft ecosystem, it went down, right? The volume went down. However, the problem with that is what is there was the critical vulnerabilities went up, right? These are vulnerabilities, especially for those of us that are here, since we may be talking about supply chain, and maybe you are formally using more of the features of dynamics in that, or you're possibly even customizing with something with Azure and the Power Platform or Fabric, right, to manage your supply chain. When you have those critical vulnerabilities, because the order in which this works is vulnerabilities reported, and then it's also critical, and then it goes to exploited. And if it's been exploited, that means a customer has been attacked, or that particular vulnerability allowed access into areas of information to these, criminals attacking our data. So, we have to understand these patterns, and the patterns really do matter. In 2024, Microsoft released this this report about the Storm 0501 threat actor. And this threat actor is not uncommon, in what it does. In fact, it represents the rise of the hybrid attack, where you have a compromise of a credential, and that attack, based upon what Microsoft's talking about, you have this hour and 42 after the compromise occurs and the spread begins. So in this case, the spread goes back into the physical infrastructure, goes up into the cloud, so like Exchange and OneDrive and SharePoint and all of those areas of data. And then it goes out into the endpoints, right, to the laptop desktops. And here's what this particular pattern, and this is still an active threat actor. So they are still doing what they are doing, right? So they are looking for data. They're looking for sensitive data very specifically. They're finding that data, reading that data, exfiltrating that data. And then in this case, right, their pattern is they are encrypting what's remaining, right? Encrypting that the rest of the data. So here you have, or it goes encryption and then exfiltration. So here you have a pattern. And if you're not familiar with the threat actor, or in general, the threat actors that are attacking the Microsoft ecosystem, and you're not familiar with the patterns under which, what they're doing to the data or the impacts to that data, that's where the first part of this question, the questions that you're faced with, which is how resilient can you be if you don't understand what you're facing? And every year, Microsoft releases a report. It's called the Digital Defense Report. And they release it in October, right before Microsoft Ignite. And last October's was, I think, maybe the 5th or 6th. I think the 5th. And it too talks about the patterns, right? The patterns of what has occurred in the prior year, based upon the attacks, based upon all of the analytics, based upon, right, their own data about their ecosystem. And if you are not familiar with the impact of what encryptions and exfiltrations will have on your organization, and I'll explain the statistics. So 3 years ago, Microsoft first reported of encryptions and exfiltration. So that's a pairing. And that number was about 16%. What that means is, of the successful ransomware attacks, 16% of those resulted in encryptions and exfiltrations. Okay, so there's that. Then the year after, that number that was reported was 23%. Last year, in October of 2025, they reported that number went up. So it's like roughly around 30%. So 30 of the 30% of all of the successful ransomware attacks, you had to deal with encryptions and exfiltrations and answer the questions that are associated with that. And then you have the rise of the hybrid attack. And the hybrid attack is very simple. Just like the Storm 0501, the attack goes both to the cloud infrastructure as well as the physical infrastructure, right? Your network infrastructure. I think the biggest number that came out of this digital defense report last year was the rise of all the successful identity attacks. The year before, Microsoft attributed 42% of those attacks to the identity layer. Right? So the compromise of a credential. Last year's number went up to 80%. So 80% of those attacks that were successful were resulting in the identity layer compromise. And they're attributing that rise to still compromise of a credential, but also the compromise of a token, and as well as these criminals using AI themselves. Right? We're not the only ones using AI in our day-to-day. These criminal cyber, these attackers are also utilizing the same tools that we all have access to. Okay. So understanding how your data is going to be affected allows you to challenge your own preparedness about what you need to do before you are attacked. And one of those things, just as a good example, is in understanding the duration of the logs that you have. All riddled throughout Microsoft's cloud ecosystem, you have logs and licenses, right? Those logs are associated with a user or an object. So as a collaboration license, you might have an E3 license, and the logs for my activity will purge for anyone. I believe that log purges like 93 days or 90 days. If you have an E5, the logs will stick around longer. I think 365 days. And these are the types of things that we have to also do a much better job about from a collaboration perspective. If we know if an admin who manages the Entra ID or Microsoft 365 world understands where these logs are, they have knowledge of that. They should communicate and collaborate with the security team to say, how are you ingesting? Where are you going to pull this data in somewhere because these logs purge? And oftentimes you can get an organization to invest in a higher level license because they want this data, or they're going to invest in pulling that data, right, this log data somewhere else, but just to know and understand that that is an issue. And we'll talk a little bit more about that timing issue. So when organizations, as they are maturing in their cyber posture, what you find is organizations are adopting a cyber incident response workflow, right? How are we going to respond if we think we are under attack? Or is this thing that I'm seeing an alert, an action, something of, that is real? Or is it, is it a fake alert? Is it an anomaly? And within that cyber incident response, regardless of how big your organization is, so you might have two people that are part of this cyber incident response, and maybe you have an MSP that's involved, or you might have like larger organizations, like 20 individuals that are part of a cyber incident response. What you have are roles throughout that response, and those roles have different questions that they are seeking the answers to. And when they get to their part, they will either say yes or no, or this can continue, or I have everything that I need. And if you are an admin of the identity layer, right, an Active Directory or an Entra or user management or endpoint management or 365, any Dynamics, Power BI, if you're an admin, and if you have not participated in your organization's cyber response playbook for the Microsoft data or any data, then how will we understand how to be prepared for that response? Right, so this is a big question that I do ask when I'm in person, is how many have been part of authoring that playbook or even just seen it? And it's amazing that still, even after all this time, that most people don't even know if there's one that exists. So with that, we have to do a better job at taking part of challenging our preparedness for a cyber response, because a lot of roles today, just even as we go about our normal day-to-day business, we have knowledge about our areas. As a good example, a solutions architect for Microsoft 365 knows about where all of the solutions are, right? I migrated the entire legal process out of the Ignite platform and into Microsoft 365. So it uses Teams, it uses a SharePoint, right, library to house the contracts. It uses Power Automate, right, to go through the workflows and so on and so forth. I also know that there's time sensitive solutions out there, but I'm the only one that knows that, myself and the team. I haven't communicated with the backup admin as a perfect example. And that backup admin is trying to prepare and say, I have a tool to recover data, but they don't have a plan for how they're going to recover data in the tenant. And this is where the lack of collaboration will make your response, and during the time of an active attack or even post attack, your ability to have less chaos, right? Throughout that. So we have to communicate and collaborate and challenge each other's and ensure that we have a response in mind. So this whole situation of collaboration also gets worse with the adoption of AI. So we'll just talk about like the Microsoft ecosystem and use of Copilot for that example. Oftentimes it's, yes, we're going to do it, and then let's get some licenses, and then let's go forward. In being a solutions architect, I was always about designing and building the requirements and understanding the business problem and spending so much time on that aspect before one line of code was ever written. And that's not the situation we are finding ourselves in with a lot of AI development, right? They are just moving forward and too fast. And in that move, no one's communicating, definitely not collaborating with the security team, with your infrastructure team, your backup team, helping your DLP team, helping everyone to understand what's being consumed in that model. How are we using that? So when we step into the use of AI, right, overnight, just by the nature of adding that license and us starting this process, we've immediately added 5 additional threat vectors without changing a single thing, without the development team, the engineer, even having communicated with the security team, with even understanding what the risks and the impacts. There's no governance. That happens. That's exactly what is happening today. And when you look at how this ecosystem is authenticated, generally you're using an SSO of some sort, and that SSO, the original problems that SSO solved were valid. Access management, and generally it was to applications that were installed on network, and then also the password reset. Right, that was like the number one ticket for many years for a help desk. But now the problems that exist, especially with the rise of the cloud and the adoption of the cloud, is that the compromise of that account and the management of all of these cloud-based applications presents even more of a risk when you do have a compromise. Right? There was a stat, I mentioned the Digital Defense Report, and there was a stat that just dropped off the report about 3 years ago, and that was 99% attempt to attack the backups. It is what happens with these criminals come in, whether or not they've been doing discovery for a period of time, but when the attack occurs, one of the first things that they are trying to do and go after is all the backup data. Right? They need to remove that as an option for you to be resilient. So from an AI perspective, and you think about both, we'll talk about third-party vendors in a second, but we'll think about all of these plugins that exist today. These are just the few that are already published today in the Microsoft catalog, right? And that means if I move forward with this true blind trust, I'm just going to pick an app because it does something in the model that I need it to do. And I haven't pressed the pause button, and I haven't communicated with my security team, and I don't have an understanding of what the operational security practices are of these vendors. We should assume that one day, you'll find another SolarWinds event in a plugin, through a plugin. These criminals are smart, right? They went and attacked SolarWinds in such a way that they took their time. And the world literally was affected by that event. And the same thing, they're not just sitting back waiting, they're already identifying who their targets are. Because you have to remember when the model is being executed, like when someone is actually calling on and prompting, you have an authenticated user. So an authenticated user will be running this already, no prompt for credentials. So we have to be mindful of the risks to AI. And now with regards to vendors, third-party vendors, Microsoft says like there's an average of about 106 enterprise applications that are deployed into your Entra ID today. Right? That means if you don't have a policy of auditing and you don't understand what the permissions are, or if you haven't utilized even a service principal or a service account to deploy that, you don't you're not prepared to answer the question, how safe, right, is this data that this third party vendor has pulled out of their environment? So a good example is Druva. We utilize the Graph APIs. We reach into your tenant through deployed applications, and we read the data, and we store that data in our own environment. So you need to understand what the security mechanisms are of both within these applications, anyone from CrowdStrike to data classification platforms to reporting, anyone that is deploying these applications. And you need to understand if that compromise actually reached into those systems because you are using SSO, how safe will our data be? How secure? How will we ensure that that data is there still, right, from compromise? Now, that's that operational practice. So you have to have some audit. And as you have new and additional enterprise applications that get deployed, you also need to have the same baseline of questions that you ask every one of these vendors. Doesn't matter what the vendor, who the vendor is, right? It could even be some company that Microsoft also owns. It doesn't matter. So we need to know how we're going to protect that data, how that data is transmitted back and forth. What is the operational security practices of that? All of these things pose risks for us if we don't. Now, when we talk about this ecosystem, and I touched on it with the identity layer, right? The identity layer in this case of most hybrid is that you have an Active Directory on-prem, and you have also then Entra ID in the cloud. And there's a syncing, right, between that. And ultimately, all of these applications and data underneath, they all utilize that identity layer to authenticate access into the data. And so the identity layer, by all means, is the first to be impacted. It is also the first that has to be validated as being clean and, if needed, restored. So a simple question I also ask companies when I'm presenting this in person is, how many of you are using the conditional access policies as a good example? Most of the time, people raise their hands. Majority people raise their hands. And then I follow that up with the question of, how many of you know from last week alone, which day represented the cleanest version of your conditional access policies and how are they configured? And those hands just drop. Why? Because there's only one point of time, which is now, right? There's now in Entra ID. And if you experience what's called a systemic identity attack, even just a regular attack, but a systemic identity attack is you've been booted out of your tenant. Microsoft worked hard to remove those criminals, those accounts, and then they gave you access back to your tenant. The first question you have is, what was affected? And that's part of, right, the issue that we cannot be waiting until after we're attacked to be able to answer that. So a backup of your identity layer provides you two really core fundamental functionalities. One is the ability to restore to a prior point of time. The other one is your ability to do analytics, right? Since you have started this session, your Entra ID is different. The simple question is it good or bad? So you need historic data for you to do that analysis to say, yes, nothing has changed within these workspaces, these groups, these sites, the membership, anything, our PIM configuration, none of that has changed, right? So identity and managing and backing up the identity layer is critical. It is the first step. The other thing that we have to do is in our just day-to-day practices of how we interact with Entra ID especially, right? And we look at things like being more predictable. What I mean by that is if you are working with a security team And that security team is dealing with these alerts. And the first thing that they're going to do in their cyber incident response is they have to identify if that alert is real or not. And if you haven't communicated or standardized, at least when you onboard or offboard, that becomes a little bit more complex, which means the response time is going to be longer for them. So consider that you might want to onboard on certain days and offboard on other days. And then you would have a place where you would have some sort of change control. And having worked in IT or with IT for many years, I know that word, those two words are, people tend to generally shy away from. Some companies are better than others, about logging their change control. So if you don't have a change control practice, it doesn't matter at this point where you log that. It could be a PowerPoint, it could be an Excel file, it could be a SharePoint list, it could be another application. But you want to have a place that you've said and you've created a policy that says, all right, I will only onboard on these days. And then if you by chance do something outside of your general policy that you're creating, you have a log because then that security team will be able to go to that. And right, they're not an identity admin. They're not managing the onboarding or offboarding, so they don't know what you're doing on a daily basis. So this change control log will help, um, help them either move something forward. They're going to see this and say, why did we create an account on a Sunday? We don't do that. Right? And then they can move forward. Or they're going to go look at this log to say, oh, that was something that was done on purpose. So there's a number of these things about being more predictable to help, especially from a cyber incident response. And in many cases, it's to kind of rule things out. Now, when we talk about the actual recovery, we have to first understand how vendors like Druva are connecting to your tenant, to the world. And we utilize the Microsoft APIs, in this case, right? Most of the graph APIs. And within an hour's period of time, I can read so much data. And in that same hour period of time, I can write much less data, right? Writing takes longer. So there's no magic button. If you have 1,000 users, 100 users, or 100,000 users, there literally is no button that says, I want all my data back. No vendor will be able to provide that for you. Even Microsoft has its own backup, right? Its own paid backup. And ultimately, what you're dealing with is an understanding of how that works, how much data you can move through. And that means you need to consider a different approach to tiering your objects in your Microsoft Cloud ecosystem. That's users, that's devices, that's Azure VMs, that's databases, and so on and so forth, site collections, right? We need to do a better job at doing this. We did this for many years in the on-prem, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. That means whatever applications are in tier 1, they have to be up and running, right? There's an SLA. In the world of Microsoft, we're not, which means if you have 1,000 users and you were hit with an attack, what would you literally want the backup admin just to start at users starting with the letter A? Right? That's not a way that you're going to be able to get through this. So you have to be more strategic about what you're going to recover, because through that first tier, you're going to go through a cycle. You're going to have to identify what was affected. Where's your evidence coming from? What needs to be cleaned? And what I mean by that is that unlike like a laptop or a desktop, when you are recovering, if you're so lucky, right? If you're lucky to have a backup, that if you are recovering data into OneDrive or SharePoint or Azure files, things that have version history for Microsoft, and the file is corrupted and you recover what you are believing to be a clean file, it's just going to iterate another version, leaving in place the corrupted file. And you can't do that, right? So you have to have an asset and a PowerShell and a person that's going to actually perform this function to clean the data. And they're going to use that. They're going to practice that. That script's going to live somewhere. And when they're called upon in this cyber incident response, they're going to do the thing that they're supposed to do. Right? So, and then you're going to rinse and repeat. They're going to go to the next tier. And this includes sensitive data, time-sensitive data and sensitive data. Azure resources as well, like Azure application servers. So most people are under the impression that if they recover maybe like a database, that might be good enough. But the reality is, if that came from a custom application, you have to recover both the application server, which generally resides on something like an Azure VM or a VM overall, um, and then the database, everything that's related to it. So this is where the collaboration has to come into play, is understanding what are all these resources that are in this tier one and what are the dependencies. And then you're going to cycle through. And by no means am I saying that the call center is not important enough, but it's not business critical to be, maybe in this case, it's not business critical to be restored within the first period of time, right? So cycle through, understand what's affected. And that leads us to the bigger question, which is what was affected, right? You had this systemic identity attack. You have your tenant back. Now there's no one place in this tenant, in the Microsoft tenant, that you're going to have a dashboard, a list of every single site collection that was affected and how, and the assets for it. That the half 500,000 files that you have of your 6 million files, those were affected and altered, but how and when? Your Azure VMs, your Azure files, your OneDrive, all of this stuff doesn't exist. And this is where maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, right at the time that I came to Druva, there was this separation, segregation of data protection. So one group stayed true to backup and recovery. They might have been on-prem as well, and they just added more workloads. While the other group of data protection vendors like Druva, right? Druva was in early in our world, was on the Gartner Visionary Quadrant, right? For many years before it was on the Leader Quadrant. And you're a visionary because you're able to do things like this. We've built a large language model that taps into the historic snapshot data at an object level. So like my OneDrive or my laptop, those types of things. And we've built a pattern about the data. And that becomes critical because you're looking at anomaly detection on historic patterns. And if you have this anomaly detection and you're able to say the backup is coming in of an endpoint laptop or of a OneDrive, something is different. Something is so different it is above the line, the threshold. Or no, it's okay, and you continue on. That's what cyber resilience, that was where the shift of cyber resilience began, was that you're utilizing your historic backup snapshot data to help you also provide some better, visibility, some alerting. And we have customers that utilize this type of alert, especially for like endpoint data protection, where those Microsoft Purview policies don't push down right to the laptop, desktop, where you're seeing that they're utilizing these alerts as part of additional signals for their security. So this is part of the first step, understanding that. And then you have other steps, right? That PowerShell admin needs a place to understand what they're supposed to go clean up, right? They've scripted it, they've tested that, and then now they need the asset that says, okay, here's the 500,000 files riddled throughout the world of SharePoint or OneDrive or wherever it is. And now I'm going to go execute the script because I've tested it and everyone's good to go. And bam, we're off and running. I've done my part. So this cyber incident response involves so many different functions, and every one of those roles requires different assets to start their part of it and then to also turn around and end it or execute. So I mentioned that I was, I used to, where I speak at conferences, and about 2 years ago, I started speaking at security conferences. And I asked this question early on, which was, what's the mean time to detect? Right. And the average time that these security admins were getting, and I've spoken at conferences from all through, of course, the United States and from, Asia to Europe and just beyond. And so the average that they started off with was about 140 days. Right? That's 140 days. Right now, the average, it's like 2 years later, is like down to 120 days. That's 120 days before these criminals are found, before we realize that there's someone in our environment. Okay. And a lot could happen in that. And tell you even the protections that we use, and I love this platform, right? I built my career around it. But now the features that we are using to also protect ourselves are becoming used against us. So even utilizing purview and building out sensitivity labels and then building policies that apply that to different email or files all throughout our tenant, that data is being used against us because these criminals are going into purview, they're going to query, they're not going to download, they're not going to read, right? They're not going after that. What they're doing is discovery. So in cyber kind of cyber organizations, you generally don't have one group that does everything, right? They don't do everything anymore. So you might have the one criminal organization that does the credential harvesting, and they sell that data to another group, and that group might do the discovery, right? So a good example was, or how that works is like last year, CrowdStrike released their 2025 report. So what they stated was within, I think, under 30 minutes, maybe even less, that these criminal organizations had done a full discovery, network discovery, right, of the entire organization under 30 minutes. So these guys are doing discovery in this window of time, and then they're selling that discovery data maybe to another organization that actually executes the attack. So part of that is them building this heat map of who the targets are. And then you just have to mirror that and understand that when you have the Storm 0501 threat actor, they're going after OneDrive and email, and they're going after sensitive data, and they're going after laptops and desktops still. And we're not having to, these criminals are not having to go after everyone. They're going after a targeted group of users, right? The most impact possible. And this is also when you think about the laptops and desktops out there, there's still sensitive data on these devices, on the laptop, on your laptop. There are users that in their normal day-to-day function, I'm an HR specialist, an HR generalist, I'm onboarding, I am finance, I'm legal, I am risk, whatever it is, right? I have data that resides on my laptop and desktop. And then now you introduce these developers for, let's just even focus it on just Copilot. And these users, these developers, whether they're developing on an Azure VM or they're developing on a desktop, right, or their laptop, whatever it may be, they house information because they have connectivity into all of these sources of data that they are, one, driving some authentication, right, and pulling that data into into the model and building around that. So there is still sensitive data. Otherwise, you wouldn't have groups like Handala going after sensitive data and then deleting all of the devices. You wouldn't have that Storm 0501 going after data, sensitive data on the laptop if it didn't exist. So I can, even for these Copilot, like these developers, I can easily say, right, they're going to go to admin.microsoft.com, go to the products, go into the licenses, go look for the licenses for anything with Copilot, whether it's the new E7, right, or anything else that has a Copilot designer. And I'm going to go see who's assigned to those licenses. You see, I don't have to go after the entire engineering department, the entire development team. I just have to go after the right ones, the right people. And that's what we're having to deal with is this risk. I've talked a lot about data and sensitive data. Now I'm going to talk about time-sensitive data. Time-sensitive data is different. So a good example of time-sensitive data that's in your tenant, this stuff is already there, whether you realize this or not. Time-sensitive data is this. I'm a construction or engineering company. For the last 3 months, we have a team that's been working on a bid, and that bid is due next Monday at 12 p.m. It's not due at 12:01. If it got turned in at 12:01, we would be eliminated from that bid process. So that time, that bid package represents maybe 20% of our revenue next year. Now, you've experienced an attack, and let's kind of step through with some of the numbers that you've heard. And let's say you're so lucky. If you're so lucky, your security team says, oh, they came in about 2 weeks ago, 7 days ago. And if you are also so lucky, you have a backup. And they're going to tell that backup admin, go restore the data to 7 days ago. or day 8, and your team is all up in arms because they're like, no, we just started back. We just finished working on that over the weekend. We can't we can't turn in something that's 2 weeks old, right? But that data is all encrypted, and that's all you're getting back. So what's called a point of time. So this is also the difference between a backup company and a cyber resilience vendor, right? A backup company is going to say, I have a prior point of time I can offer you. And that prior point of time is where the security team gave that date, and that backup admin is going to execute. That's very different. And they don't know the state of all of those files in there. That just happens to be when they're saying when they entered. And what Microsoft is telling us is that these attacks are not like sledgehammer attacks. They're not coming in and doing everything all at once so that you have a clean line and a delineation between a start and an end, is that they are affecting this data slowly and over that period of, remember that mean time to detect. They've been in for 120 days. They're not going to just pick a date that is convenient for you for a point of time recovery. So this is where you have cyber resilience features, right? Cyber resilience features is saying, okay, Druva, we're going to build this feature that looks at several, like 14 snapshots. That window of time that the security team says, right, is when they believe that this occurred. And they're going to look at this from an object level, your laptop, your OneDrive, right, your CISO's OneDrive, any object that we're backing up, and you're going to build a snapshot that never existed of the last known clean file, right? This is the historic data that this is how your organization taps into your backups. Beyond that concept of a point of time recovery, you're using the properties of that. And what we also understand is when that file changed, right? When it went from a clean file to a bad encrypted file. So that's the difference between a cyber incident response. One point of time will result in a ton of tickets of someone coming back and saying, hey, no, this one file is still encrypted. And then there's another, right, that goes through the rounds. That backup admin's going to have to go through the next snapshot and then return that, go find that file until it's clean. Whereas a cyber resilience is a completely different set of features and an understanding of what the true problems are that you face. So you should expect that you will have such an experience. The question I have is, what experience do you want to have at the end? So in this case, you deal with the cyber resilience in mind and understand and prepare for that. And you're going to be able to recover your CISO's 8,700 files of the last known good clean file. Great. And then from that, we are also aware that 1,500 of those files were encrypted, and we're going to give you the output for that. And why is that important? Because remember what Microsoft is saying, that statistic that is going up. Today it's at 30% of encryptions, files that are encrypted, they're also exfiltrated. So you begin to have build your own heat map, right, for the post recovery, the post recovery forensics and analysis. But even further from that, you need to say, all right, we know that these criminals are going after sensitive data. Of that 1,500 files, 159 of those files were sensitive. So we have solved cyber resilience and working with cyber resilience vendors, utilizing your historic data, gives you the ability to solve different problems than just the click and recover. Right. So at the end, right, the GRC team, the legal team, when did it start? Who was affected? What was compromised? What's our exposure? Different questions. Then completely at the other end, the security admin saying, is this valid? Is this alert real? Do we onboard? Do we create accounts like this? And the middle person, right, the PowerShell admin who had to go in there and clean up all the data. Where's the asset that I need of everything that was affected? And then where's my script that I saved, that I've tested, I've validated, and I'm going to execute that script when I'm told? To the backup admin with the proper order of recovery, one that will get us back to, right, a better point of time and the right users and the right data at the beginning versus kind of a random process. So you have a big choice to make in terms of how do you want to get through a cyber incident. Ultimately, backup is the first step by all means. So you have to back up this data. And from there, then you can determine the level of investment, the level that you can mature into from a cyber incident response perspective. But ultimately, from your Active Directory to your Entra ID, and even like if you use something like Okta, all of that data that resides in the Microsoft Cloud ecosystem, and even on-prem, of course, um, is at risk, right? So back up your data and start that resilience process. So normally I'm able to answer questions. All right, I pose some questions, but feel free if you do have questions, you can reach out to me. We can set up some time by all means, and be happy to continue answering your questions. So thank you guys for joining. This is Kier Con. Wishing you all the best. Bye.